ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
When big news breaks around the world, we've got the time to get into what's happened.
I've seen lots of robust argument, but nothing like that.
The Kremlin propagandists are very happy.
And we can find out what it means for us in Australia.
Well, I think we're like a kangaroo caught in the headlights.
What's perhaps more pertinent for Australia is ensuring that this kind of fracture that we've seen across the Atlantic is one that doesn't happen across the Pacific.
3.5 hours of Radio National breakfast condensed into a pop to the shops, maybe a tea break or a walk of the dog. You can find the new Breakfast Wrap podcast by searching for Radio National Breakfast in the ABC Listen app.
You can pick your villain when it comes to the housing crisis. Who or what is to blame? Is it immigrants, investors, Howard and Costello, the big banks, or something else? There are key moments when the market shifted. Policies and economic forces cemented property as a lucrative investment, creating a big mismatch in supply versus demand, sending house prices to extraordinarily high levels. I'm Sam Hawley from ABC News Daily. This is Housing Hostages, Episode 3, The Blame Game. Today, our business editor, Michael Janda, looks at the culprits. So we want to delve into who is to blame for why we are here, why there are so many young people facing the prospect of never owning their own home. We actually asked our listeners this question and they had a lot of very good ideas about what and who is to blame.
The biggest issue with the housing market is the capital gains tax and negative gearing. It just incentivises people to grow their property portfolio and stops people from being able to buy their first home.
I also wonder if the great Australian dream is to be blamed for this crisis and forcing people to think that there's only one way of living and only one way of securing one's own security.
We're being told that the Australian real estate market is being driven by supply concerns, yet we don't have any legal bid systems to see what other buyers have potentially placed on a property.
The housing crisis is not due to a lack of private market supply per se. It is due to a lack of social housing supply.
We're in this society that has somehow decided that the way to build wealth is commoditising what should be a human right.
So, Michael, definitely a lot of ideas there.
We've got a lot of smart listeners at the ABC, Sam, and there are a lot of correct answers. And that's the hard thing about this crisis. There isn't just one simple answer. It's complicated.
So, Michael, let's delve deep into who really is behind this rather large mess. I think to do that, it's good to step back to 1999 and what a year that was. There was the Y2K fever, of course. It's hard to forget that.
Y2K watchers remain divided. Doomsayers at one extreme, doom skeptics at the other.
Bill Clinton back then was acquitted in an impeachment hearing.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
And who can forget, the GST was introduced.
Yeah, although the prices didn't go up till the next year. More relevantly, Sam, if we go back to 1999, the average house in Brisbane cost less than $200,000. So it's over $1 million now. Wow. So it's pretty different times.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was an incredibly important year for housing too, because it marked a massive shift in how we approached it, didn't it?
It did.
I regard it as a privilege beyond belief to have been twice elected as Prime Minister of Australia.
Back in 1999, John Howard was the Prime Minister, Peter Costello was the Treasurer. They wanted to change how something called the capital gains tax works.
Life is about occasionally taking a risk, accumulating some capital, and not having it taxed at a confiscatory rate.
John Howard had long wanted to get rid of the capital gains tax, which had been introduced in the 1980s.
And if we can get these changes to capital gains tax through the Parliament, and I believe we will, then we will have one of the most competitive capital gains tax regimes in the world.
To understand why what he ended up doing was such a big shift, we really need to understand first what the capital gains tax is.
Yes, because all these housing terms and tax terms, they get complicated. Yeah, so just to explain, unpack capital gains tax.
The capital gains tax was introduced by the Hawke-Keating government in 1985. And it's the tax you pay on profits when you make money by buying and then selling things.
Mm-hmm.
If they go up in value and you make a profit, that profit gets added to your taxable earnings and it's taxed as if it was your income. But you're allowed to deduct the effect of inflation because that pushes up all prices over time. So that meant you were only taxed on what's called your real gain. But on September 20, 1999, the Howard government changed the rules overnight.
We will also dramatically reduce capital gains tax for individuals such as mum and dad investors, as well as self-funded retirees. The capital gains tax rate will effectively be cut in half.
So in short, from that date, you effectively paid half as much tax on profits from rising asset values as you did from income you made by going to work.
Right. So that's a huge change. And that really was a great thing for investors when they were selling their homes. And that made negative gearing more attractive, another term. So we better explain negative gearing as well.
Yes. So negative gearing, put simply, means that you're making a loss. You're paying more out in interest and other expenses on your investments than you're getting in income. So in the case of property, rent.
Mm-hmm.
So the tax rules have long allowed you to write off that loss against your taxable income. But the capital gains tax discount meant you not only got to cut your losses through negative gearing, but then to also legally minimise the tax you paid on any profits when you sold.
What a brilliant deal. How did this all go down at the time?
With relatively and surprisingly little fanfare. It was pretty much just waved through Parliament by the Labor opposition without too much protest. Labor backbencher Mark Latham, who later became the Labor leader, was one of the few voices of dissent.
Any smart policy maker would be looking at it and trying to work out, whether it's appropriate and what needs to be done in terms of the housing market.
Now, there were some economists at the time who were warning it might spark an asset price boom, especially in the housing market. But that change to capital gains tax was waved through so quickly that these warnings were largely ignored. Almost 4 years to the day after that change was made, as house prices were in the middle of a huge boom in the early 2000s, John Howard went on ABC radio and explained exactly why most of the politicians ignored these warnings about house prices.
I haven't found anybody in 7.5 years shake their fist at me and say, Howard, I'm angry with you for letting the value of my house increase.
Nobody was angry that house prices were going up, which is great if you own a house, but not so great if you were trying to get into the market.
Exactly right, Sam. It turns out that Mark Latham was right on that, as were economists like Saul Eslake, who warned what it might do to asset prices. These changes under the Howard government are seen by a lot of analysts as a huge factor in the house price boom that we've seen over the last quarter of a century.
Yeah, because while it sounds like, to put it mildly, a bit of a tax dodge, it is within the rules. So that led to heaps of Australians jumping into the housing market as investors, didn't it?
Well, as Kerry Packer famously once said, you'd be a mug to pay any more tax than you have to, and that's the attitude of a lot of Australians have. So we went from having less than 1.3 million people declaring rental income at the turn of the century, and that's nearly 2.3 million now. So we've had a million increase in the number of Australians who are landlords since the capital gains tax change.
Wow.
Aside from when interest rates fall to really unusually low levels like during the pandemic, most of those landlords report net losses on their investments. They're using negative gearing. So in other words, the vast majority of them hope to make a return on that investment by a capital gain. That's the value of their property increasing, more so than the rental income than they're getting. And that's meant there's now this huge culture of property investment in Australia, people just expecting the value of their asset to go up and never to fall.
So this change by John Howard and Peter Costello, in essence, it drove up house prices because more and more people were investing in property because the tax breaks were too good to resist.
There's a lot of debate, Sam, about how much it's actually driven up house prices. There's been some economic modelling done by a range of groups that suggest that these tax breaks might only push up property prices by between 1 and 4%, depending on the methods and assumptions used in the different models.
So they're basically saying prices would be no more than 4% lower if these tax breaks simply disappeared.
That's right. That's at a maximum.
Uh-huh.
But I've had long chats with some of the economists who've done this modelling. And when you talk to them, you realise that the results are fundamentally based on the assumption that all property investors are making financially rational decisions. But there's other research out there that suggests this simply isn't the case. A white paper by property firm PEXA and Longview estimated that as many as 60% of property investors would have been better off simply putting that money into their superannuation. So it's entirely possible that all this economic modelling that's been done massively underestimates the effect of removing these tax policies because it doesn't account for the effect they've had on the national psyche, this belief that property investment is a sure bet.
Okay, so Michael, there's the answer, is it? We can blame John Howard and Peter Costello for the housing crisis.
If only, Sam, it was that simple. But basically everyone agrees there isn't one single reason why we went suddenly from affordable housing to amongst the world's most expensive housing. It's taken a range of very powerful forces and they've all been pushing in the same direction. So it's one thing to set up a tax structure that gives investors the incentive to invest in property, but they also have to get the money. They need loans to pay for those homes, and that's where financial deregulation comes in.
Okay, so you've got to go slowly through this. Financial deregulation, it just seems complicated, but to explain.
And parts of it were. And this all started happening from the 1980s onwards. So again, a Hawke-Keating economic reform, one that's widely lauded amongst economists and financial market experts. They allowed foreign banks to come into the country and do retail banking. They removed some of the regulations on who could get home loans and how much they could borrow. Banks even started allowing unmarried women to get a home loan by themselves without a man. Revolutionary.
Wow. Yeah, how progressive of them.
And then you look later in the 1990s, non-bank lenders started borrowing money on global financial markets, and they could lend that out to Australian home buyers at much cheaper rates than the big four banks. And that meant a lot of people who'd previously been excluded from getting a home loan could finally get one, which is great. They could get into the housing market. There was a lot less annoying hoops for people to jump through to get a mortgage. And it allowed people to borrow a whole lot more money than they could previously. And when interest rates started coming down in the late 1990s and the Reserve Bank targeting inflation, people could borrow more still. But people are getting more money chasing the same number of houses against other people.
Yes.
So the prices go up.
Jared Minack, I'm a director of my own business, Minack Advisors.
Now, Jared Minack's worked in finance for more than 3 decades, and For some of that time, he was the global strategist for US investment banking giant Morgan Stanley. So that means he's seen firsthand over that time exactly what financial deregulation and lower interest rates have done to house prices, not just here, but globally.
The way most home buyers think is I can allocate that much to a mortgage payment. If I'm paying $1,000 on my mortgage and mortgage interest rates are 15%, I've got quite a small mortgage. If they fall to 5%, I can buy a bigger house because I've got a bigger capacity to borrow a mortgage. And that drives up prices.
Okay, so because we borrow more, we could also pay more for houses.
Exactly. And there was another powerful factor that fed into how much more money was being pumped into the Australian housing market. Now, the Australian banks got burned in the late 1980s by a series of corporate collapses. Westpac almost went bankrupt. And combined with the looser regulations around lending to households for home loans, it became a much more attractive place for banks to do their business.
Put very simply, Michael, if you and I walked into a bank manager and I said, Mr. Bank Manager, I want to borrow to buy my 6th investment property, and you said, Mr. Bank Manager, I want to borrow to start a small business that's going to generate income and jobs, and we've got exactly the same financial background, I will get the loan every day of the week. It is much more profitable for a bank to give me, a housing investor, a loan than it is to give a corporate money to invest in a business. And that's all a function.
What this has meant is that from the late 1980s, when 2/3 of bank loans were going to businesses, we've now gone into a position where 2/3 of bank loans are going into mortgages for housing. And guess what? That period has corresponded very closely with the house price boom.
So then tell me, do you think that's the main reason house prices exploded? That so many people could just borrow a lot more from the banks?
Well, it was definitely a factor, Sam, and it no doubt provided the ammunition that allowed prices to rise, because most of us can't just go and buy a house without getting a loan. But if you look at the data, it wasn't until this century when prices really exploded, and that goes back to those 1999 tax changes.
All right, okay. So, Michael, there is one other factor that keeps coming up over and over again when we're talking about high property prices, and that is population growth, leading to an imbalance between the physical demand for housing and the supply.
So far, Sam, we've been talking about the financial factors that have driven demand: lower interest rates, bigger loans, generous tax breaks. But there's also the physical demand of simply having more people in the country. Because even though Australians haven't been having enough babies to replace the people who die, our population has still grown at a record pace over the past couple of decades, as the mining boom and the surge in international students has led to a jump in net migration. At the back end of the 1990s, as we came into the new millennium, there were less than 19 million people living in Australia. In the 25 years since, we've added more than 8 million people to the population. And Gerard Minack says this kind of rapid population growth is common across most countries that have experienced rapidly deteriorating housing affordability.
Head and shoulders, the most important driver has been the increase in migration. And interestingly, the takeoff in house prices coincided with the big step up in population growth driven by faster migration that started in the late 1990s. And I mean, if you look around the world, there's a very close correlation between how fast population grows and the change in house price to income ratios.
So is it really that simple then, that housing supply just hasn't matched the increase in demand from a growing population, and that's what's pushed up prices?
In short, Sam, no.
Please. We're looking for someone to blame, Michael. Come on. Who is it?
Well, I've looked at the numbers quite a few times over the past 15 years or so, and I get the same sort of answer each time. Now, the house price surge of the first 2 decades of this century was, in my view, more about the financialisation of housing, that is, turning it into an investment asset and not just a place to live, than it was about any fundamental, sustained physical shortage across the country in how much housing we had. Because if you go and look at the census, and we had a census in 2001 and another one in 2021, in that 20-year period, we added one home for every 2.1 extra people. Now, given that the average household size has been pretty stable around 2.5, that suggests to me that we probably built enough homes. In fact, in the middle of last decade, I was doing stories about serious concerns from analysts that we had a potential oversupply of housing, particularly apartments in the big East Coast cities.
Wow, and that is definitely not the case. We do not have an oversupply.
We might have back then.
Yeah, right.
The picture's really changed since that last census was taken in August 2021. Think back to then. That was the middle of COVID lockdowns. The borders were closed. Since the borders reopened, we've added more than 1.5 million people to the population in about 3 years.
Wow.
Now, there's no official data on how much we've added to the housing supply, but my estimates, and they're backed by other economists, based on ABS construction figures, suggest we've added less than 450,000 homes. So when you crunch it, that's a home for every 3.5 extra people. 2.5 people in the average house, but we're only building one for every 3.5. That tells you we're not building enough. And that, to me, suggests the entire shortage has been generated in the past 3 years since borders reopened after COVID.
I have not heard that before. Okay, so if fewer people had been allowed back into the country or into the country after we reopened our borders, perhaps the supply versus demand equation would have been better.
A lot of people believe that. Most economists disagree. They think we should have just built a lot more housing. But Gerard Minack isn't one of those economists.
And we've had 25 years of this where people have been telling them, let's build more homes. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. And I think, therefore, part of the solution to making housing more affordable has to be to slow population growth. It really is difficult to build enough homes. And I would also argue what a huge waste of resources.
So why don't we just slow down the population growth?
There have been some tentative moves by the Albanese government to take the edge off population growth by limiting the number of student visas that get processed. That's expected to see net migration roughly halve over the next couple of years, from well over 500,000 back down to 225,000. And the opposition's also come out and said, without much detail, that they'll introduce similar reductions in the overall migration intake. But, and this is a big but, none of them are proposing any more drastic decreases, and there's a simple reason behind this. Powerful interest groups are loudly opposed to reducing migration and population growth for the simple reason that it's an easy way to grow revenue and profits. And it's basically a lazy way to grow the economy. Instead of increasing efficiency or productivity, which we discussed in the previous episodes, that takes intelligence, effort, and investment by business. Just growing the population grows the pie, even though all of us get a smaller slice.
Yeah, okay. So, but how does that then affect house prices? Because yes, they've been going up, as you say, a lot in the last 3 years, but they have been surging well before that, as we've discussed. So while immigration is a factor now, it may not be, the main culprit of why we got here.
I think that's right, Sam, and it's the key takeaway. There is no single reason why Australian housing became so expensive. It is the classic perfect storm.
So for anyone hoping to break into the housing market in the next few years, where does that all leave them?
Well, Sam, it's left many people cheering for a housing crash.
Yes.
And it's definitely one way to bring house prices down. It hasn't happened here, but we have seen a very recent, in fact, current example of what a housing crash looks like. And it's very close to Australia. It's across the ditch in New Zealand, and it's happening as we speak. And we're going to take a look at it in the next episode.
Brilliant. So we'll be heading to New Zealand. It'll be fascinating. Thanks so much, Michael. Catch you then.
Thanks, Sam. That's the ABC's business editor, Michael Janda.
He returns tomorrow with Housing Hostages Episode 4, Time for a Crash. Our series producer is Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. And additional production by Sydney Peed and Adair Shepherd. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. Please subscribe or follow ABC News Daily and tell your friends about us. To get in touch with the team, email us on abcnewsdaily@abc.net.au. Thanks for listening.
Hi, I'm Jan Fran, and if you're listening to ABC News Daily, I have a feeling you're going to enjoy listening to our new podcast too. It's called Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront, and it'll take you behind one of the biggest industrial showdowns in Australia's history. We're talking about that day in April 1998, when security guards wearing balaclavas and wielding Alsatians kicked 1,400 workers from their jobs on the docks. What led up to that moment? Almost has to be heard to be believed. So make sure you listen to Conspiracy: War on the Waterfront. To find it, search for Rewind on the ABC Listen app.